Terry Eastland, why did you call your new book, Energy in the Executive, the Case for the Strong Presidency?
I called it that because that was a phrase that Alexander Hamilton used basically in describing what the presidency is all about. Hamilton wrote 200 years ago, he said that energy in the executive is a leading characteristic of good government. And so I tried to bring this idea of energy into the political discussion this year.
George Will calls you on the back of the book a public philosopher seasoned by public service. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, perhaps he's referring to the fact that I did spend some time in the Justice Department. I spent 5 years from 1983 to 1988. I have 2 degrees in philosophy, so I guess George Will is referring to the fact that I have thought some about the public interest, which is true. I think this book is an expression, basically, of my understanding of the presidency and also of government. E.J.
Dionne also writes in the back about 2 points. He says, he is utterly convincing, meaning you, that ethical behavior is central, not peripheral, to a strong presidency. What's he talking about, ethical behavior?
Well, I think what he's talking about, and which I write about in the book, is the fact that we have to understand our president in terms of someone who basically has an office that he's been entrusted with. A certain degree of power has been given to the president, and he is responsible for its use to the American people. It is an ethical undertaking. And I think that basically is what I'm referring to, but I think also there's an obligation on the part of people who work for a president, who are appointed by him, also to see to it that they act morally in every case.
Are you still a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center?
That's right, Brian, I sure am.
What is the Ethics and Public Policy Center?
The Ethics and Public Policy Center is a think tank here in Washington. We have many of those, but this one originated about 14, 15 years ago. It basically focuses on the relationship between the ethical dimension of our existence and public policy. And it does a number of studies regarding public policy and religion, public policy involving the schools, the courts, the legal system.
Who supports it?
It's supported by a variety of contributors. It is a nonpartisan organization. It is a foundation-supported institution for the most part.
How big is it?
There are about 10 to 12 individuals who work there. It is a small unit compared to many of the larger ones here in town.
And who runs it?
George Weigel is the president. George, in fact, is an author of numerous books, and he has just written a new one coming out this fall dealing with the revolution in Eastern Europe over the past few years. A quite interesting book.
Who is the most ethical president in our history?
It would be very hard to say that. Who is the best, but certainly there are several who come to my mind. Certainly George Washington was regarded by his fellow countrymen at the time as quite an ethical man. I think as well Abraham Lincoln, in terms of his custody of the office, of actually keeping the Union together, has to be regarded certainly as someone who was highly ethical. Teddy Roosevelt I would regard as someone who tried to make sure that his subordinates were ethical. He investigated any charges of malfeasance against his subordinates, and he called the shots as they may. I mean, he didn't turn someone out of office just on the basis of a rumor. In fact, he would defend someone if they had been unfairly accused of something. It cuts both ways, I think, when you discuss ethics. You need both the firmness to stand behind someone if they've been unfairly accused, as well as to take action in case there is a validity to the complaint.
You say in your book that Theodore Roosevelt was one of the first of the liberal presidents.
Well, he was, in a sense. I mean, the presidency, in my mind, if you start with George Washington and go to the present, certainly it seems that with Teddy Roosevelt and really with Woodrow Wilson, we have the introduction of a new kind of presidency that's been called the rhetorical presidency. Most of us think of presidents in terms of their public speeches, and certainly Ronald Reagan did nothing to change that perception. But it's with Teddy Roosevelt, really, that we get the idea of a president who will constantly be using that bully pulpit, who will be urging the American people to move on to greater heights, if you will. Woodrow Wilson was the theorist, by the way, a former college professor, of the bully pulpit. But we have seen its use really by presidents in the 20th century. By the way, the Founding Fathers really had little use for presidential rhetoric. In fact, they worried that presidents who went out and spoke a lot would be demagogues, that they would be making the worst kind of appeals to the American people.
Did the Founding Fathers who became president live it?
By and large, they did. If you go back and you look at the kind of speeches that our presidents in the 19th century gave, late 18th and 19th century, what you find is, of course, that they gave some ceremonial addresses. But what they did not do, they did not go out, for example, and make a tour asking the American people to rally behind the president against Congress in behalf of some legislative proposal that the president had on the Hill. That is just simply unknown. Of course, we didn't have technology, the kind of technology that could equip a president to go out and deliver that message. But the one time there was a departure from that with Andrew Johnson, right after Abraham Lincoln, we all recall that he almost got impeached. Well, one of the articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson dealt with, in fact, the kind of speeches he made. You couldn't imagine someone trying to indict a president on the basis of speeches today. Everyone regards speeches as part of the job. In fact, most of the job in some people's minds.
Your subhead here, in the case for the strong presidency, who are the strongest presidents in history?
Well, clearly, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, I think, would have to be described as quite strong. I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in many respects, was a strong president. I think, though, that when I answer that question, I have to ask myself, in what aspect of the presidency are we looking at? And because it seems that sometimes a president might be strong in some areas and weak in other. For example, George Bush, in my view, is strong in an institutional sense. He has defended the office of the presidency, in fact, better than Ronald Reagan did. That was Ronald Reagan's, one of Ronald Reagan's weaknesses as a president, in my view. George Bush has been stronger in defending the prerogatives of office. The irony is he might leave this to Bill Clinton. He has been weaker, though, than Ronald Reagan in a political sense. I mean, George Bush's most obvious weakness, it seems to me, is that he has not been able to communicate to the American people what his political identity is. And going into this election season, that may be one of the things that hurts him. But I think that when you look at a strong presidency, you have to ask which instance, what episode, what context do we mean that in?
Early in your book, it's kind of set up as an answer to or an antithesis of Richard Neustadt's book on the presidency. Who's Richard Neustadt, and did I characterize it right?
Right. Richard Neustadt is probably, well, certainly he's one of the most distinguished political scientists who have written over the presidency in the past generation. His 1960 book on presidential power remains clearly the most influential book, so far as I know, in the study of the presidency. It's widely used, by the way, by journalists and others in this town. And there are many things that you can learn, that one can learn from Richard Neustadt's book. But I think one area in which I differ, and in fact I take him on in my book, is in understanding the office of the presidency. I think that the formal powers of office, the formal powers that we find in the Constitution, are essential to understanding presidential power and the strength of a president. In my view, Richard Neustadt simply gives short shrift to those powers. But I think that we need to understand the presidency in terms of the Constitution. I've appended it, in fact, to my book so that one can see exactly what the Constitution says about the president, as well as the other branches of government.
Actually, I was looking for that while you were speaking because I wanted to ask you, I don't know how many pages you devoted to this in the book. Was this a hard decision to make, to actually put the Constitution in here?
Well, no, it was not, because the reason I included the Constitution in there, Brian, again, is to make the point through the very structure of my book that it's important that we understand the presidency in terms of what the Constitution says about it, and also in terms of its relationship to the other three branches of government. Now, this is very important. A lot of the people who study the presidency are what I would call focused almost exclusively on the presidency to the neglect of the other branches. My argument for a strong presidency is not an argument for a monarch. It's not an argument for a presidency that ignores the other two branches. And it's important to understand those branches. By the way, the structure of my book, as you know, I begin, there are three parts to the book: the President and Congress, the President and the executive branch, and then the third part is the President and the appointment of judges. Now, if you pull out the Constitution, you'll see the Constitution deals in Article 1 with Congress, in Article 2 with the presidency, and in Article 3 with the judiciary. So my book, in a way, tries to understand by the very structure of the book there the way in which the presidency relates to these other branches.
Actually, it'd be fair, you'd have to say there are 5 parts of this book, plus the Constitution, the 4th, and the 5th, which I want to get into, are the notes.
Right.
General question, why so much devoted to notes?
Well, one reason for that is that